All right, before we begin the afternoon session, let's just take a moment to refresh our motivation. So, again, we can think about once more this idea that we're working with this weekend of trying to confront these states of mind that are not so beneficial to ourselves, and certainly they also, affect others around us. And the initial level of motivation as we meditated this morning was to think that we're doing this to have greater peace of mind ourselves, to have more positive states of mind, to not be creating the causes for our own suffering, dissatisfaction. But moreover, because how we are in the world affects others, because our thoughts, attitudes, actions do have a bearing on others, we can also think that we're here for those that we do come into contact with. Think about your family, friends, partners, pets, whoever it is that is in your direct experience. Think about being here for them, to work on yourself, to learn more about your own mind and these harmful habits, so you can be a greater source of well-being and joy in their lives. And then, as I said this morning, try to extend that out. In these Mahayana Buddhist teachings, we all have Buddha nature, meaning we all have the potential to develop our minds to an infinite degree, to have qualities so far beyond what we currently possess, and to be completely free of all negativities. And we do that with the intention of benefiting all beings, not just those that we have directly in our lives right now, but those beings who are just like us at this moment, under the control of these factors, under the control of our deluded states of mind. And wouldn't it be wonderful if the work we do here today could become a cause for us to be able to help those beings perfectly, skillfully. And in order to do that, we do have to become enlightened. We do have to fully ripen our own minds. So we're thinking kind of those two thoughts. Being here at the greatest level to benefit all beings, and recognizing that to do that, we have to become enlightened. Therefore, we're going to engage in this discussion and exploration of how we work with these harmful habits, to let go of them, to move to more positive states of mind, so we can accomplish those goals. Okay. Good enough. All right, any questions from this morning? Let me recap real quickly what we looked at. Okay, again, this is the structure for the overall weekend. We're looking at these 3 difficulties that are set out in one slogan of the mind training text, the 7-point mind training by Geshe Chikawa, which isn't the main subject we're studying here in terms of the whole text. It's just this one slogan that says train in the 3 difficulties. This is training in first identifying the negative states. This is what we've been looking at. And in blue here, I put up the how Pema Chodron has these in her book, Start Where You Are. Again, Pema Chodron is a Western teacher in Tibetan Buddhism in the Kagyu, mostly Kagyu tradition of Chogyam Trungpa. I think he also had some kind of Nyingma leanings. But anyway, she calls the first one seeing neurosis as neurosis. Seeing our states of mind that are negative for what they are and identifying them as such, kind of knowing when they're arising. And this is what we've been mostly focusing on, and I'll go back to that in a moment. When we finish that, we'll go on to this idea of counteracting them. This is the second difficulty, the second major thing that we're going to look at. And she calls that doing something different, breaking our habitual pattern and doing something different. Not just different as let's just try this and try that. It's doing something different that's going to be more skillful. And then finally, what we're calling eliminate them, she just calls this gently, continuing that way, that we're going to want to reinforce those patterns and continue to do what is different. Instead of, as we did in the exercise, putting our hands together in the very comfortable way, we're going to look at a different way of doing that is going to be something we have to train in again and again. And this is the ability that our minds have to eventually change completely. One thing I like to point out occasionally when I teach, just to remind people in this tradition, in Tibetan Buddhism, When all the Sanskrit teachings came into Tibet, all of the language was translated into Tibetan words. And the word Buddha, which means awakened one, Bodhi is like for bodhicitta, this is the mind of awakening, the mind that wishes to awake. When they took the word Buddha and translated it into Tibetan, they didn't keep the meaning of a word that would essentially mean awakened. Instead, they took this word Buddha that means awaken and made the equivalent for it Sangye. Sangye has two words to it. Sang meaning to completely purify, and Gye meaning to fully develop. So just as we've been talking in terms of having these negative and positive states, fully purifying means to completely remove what is negative. So a Buddha is a being who has done that, who has removed every obscuration in the mind. All the delusions as well as the subtle imprints of those, all these seeds we talked about, predispositions, everything completely removed. Without a doubt, they are all gone completely. It's like that glass of water that I mentioned that our minds are comparable to. Every bit of dirt has been removed. Every stain in the mind is gone. Gye means to fully develop. And what do we fully develop? All the positive qualities. So a Buddha is a being whose mind is imbued with perfect compassion for all beings, without exception. Perfect love, perfect wisdom, is this wellspring of unbelievable positive potential. And we have the seeds of that. We have Buddha nature by virtue of having a mind that is fundamentally pure and clear, that all this stuff can be removed from, and everything that is complementary to that state of mind can be fully developed. Everything that is in line with truth. When we were looking at this whole thing, I didn't go into the other side of it. I was kind of talking about how the delusions, the negative states of mind, the harmful habits, how they aren't rooted in truth. But let's take a look at the opposite side and just get the conviction that what we're talking about developing as the complement to these, once we identify the negative states and we begin to counteract them, as I'll already introduced this here because we've already brought up this idea of seeing that the delusions are out of touch with reality. They're not truthful. They're something that can be defeated because they are not able to be withheld in the space of wisdom, in the space of knowledge. Well, let's look at the other side of it then. What is the mind that is contrary to anger or hatred? The mind of love, right? When we have love present in the mind, hatred can't be present in the mind. We have hatred in the mind, love can't be present in the mind, at least for the duration of that emotion, that thought. So what is love? Anyone? How do we define love in Buddhism?
Not wanting other people to suffer.
That's a part of it. Sometimes we give that definition to compassion, which is together with love frequently. Compassion looking at the suffering side of things. Love is looking at the happiness side of things and kind of having a similar thought, saying we want beings to be happy and to have the causes of happiness. And we want them to not suffer and not have the causes of that suffering. But in essence, these are the way those two are delineated, but obviously they're very close, kind of like two sides of the same coin. So when we hold the thought, like say there's that person, we're back in that scenario where you're in your car and you've, for whatever reason, the person behind you is honking at you and you look in your rearview mirror and you see their red, angry face, really upset at you. And maybe they're giving you a particular finger that's on their hand. Not this one, not that one, not that one. Anyway. So when you look at them through the eyes of love, you are holding the thought in opposition to anger that's kind of focusing narrowly on those negative aspects, on that red face and that manifestation in that moment of that person, and thinking that's the sum total of their being. Rather, you are focusing on them in a much broader way, right? Love is looking at them through the lens of seeing them as a being that wants to be happy, seeing them as a being that doesn't have the causes of happiness, right? And it's simply wishing for them to have that. Can you find anything in that, just as a conventional statement, wanting that being who's in the car behind us to be happy and to have the causes of happiness, that is out of line with truth? No, because there's no mistaken perspective of them. They're a being who wants to be happy, right? We're in touch with that. We see them through that lens. We're not pigeonholing them into, unlike the mind of anger, that pigeonholes them into that being who is kind of upset and getting angry at us and honking the horn at us. We're not pigeonholing them into that and making that the sum total of their being. Rather, once more, we have that broader perspective. They are simply a being like us, like all beings that wants to be happy, wants to have those causes of happiness. It's totally in line with truth. And it, moreover, can be upheld even at the deeper level. When we get to the third there of kind of eliminating them, we'll talk about the wisdom of emptiness, of selflessness. Even when we hold the view that this is not a real being and I'm not a real I and we're not having a real experience in the way that we think we do, we still can uphold that because there still is an experience, albeit a very subtle one. There still is them and us and everyone else. It's just a much different perspective. But even in the space of that selflessness and emptiness, love can be upheld. Compassion can be upheld. Generosity can be upheld. All the positive emotions can be upheld. And in fact, they even flourish greater when we have that wisdom. Because once more, that's what a Buddha is. A Buddha is a being who has developed those qualities to this infinite degree in the space of their wisdom. Because it's their wisdom that has eventually removed everything that is negative as well. So, when we get to this third one, we'll talk a bit more about that wisdom. But just know that when we contrast how a mind that is angry is thinking about things versus a mind that is in the state of love, loving kindness, we see that there's a total opposition in terms of this one being grounded in mistaken conceptualization, being grounded in incorrect ways of looking at things, and this one being totally upheld in truth. This is why His Holiness says that we can overcome the delusions and actually generate all these positive states of mind to that degree, is because there's a solid foundation for the positive ones and there's an unstable foundation for the negative ones. We know this again from the world that we live in, even that when things have a stable foundation, they are able to be maintained. When they don't, they will topple. They won't be able to withstand. So any final questions on like that whole topic before we're going to talk a bit more, because again, we've had 3 of the 6 we've looked at so far, and we're going to continue to look at the third one. Maybe I should have put them on the board too. We have 6 factors that I'm examining that help us to identify the causes of the negative states. In other words, that help us to understand what's going on behind the scenes so that we can see them more clearly. And we can be tuned into when we're likely to have them arise. And the first was contact with the object. The second was the seeds or predispositions of these delusions, these habits that we have, that will rise again given the proper conditions. When you have those 2 things, that we've got the seeds of these and we meet with the proper stimulus to produce that, then the next step plays a big role in kind of furthering it on, making ourselves crazy with our habits and delusions. And that's this inappropriate attention. We also might call this mistaken conceptualization. And we've looked at this idea that a lot of it is this exaggeration that we do, not being in line with truth and so on. I also mentioned this morning that you have an identification with our thoughts that is really not so useful. And I like what Martine Batchelor says on this. Her book is actually called Let Go. But she talks about this kind of how we have 3 levels of perceptions when it comes to these negative states of mind or these habits. So we've been using this one, fear, or some sort of trepidation that we might have, particularly when we're confronted with criticism, some lack of self-confidence that we might be experiencing. And she actually uses fear in her book on page 14. She says there's 3 levels of perception using the example of fear. First, we might think there is fear in my mind, and that simply describes an experience. And that's the most beneficial way to look at it. There is fear in my mind, or there is anger in my mind, there is jealousy in my mind, there is any of these things that we've talked about, thought patterns simply arising in our mind. She says the second level of perception is I am afraid, starts the process of identification with this experience. So I am angry, I am jealous. It's like you're starting to put the I equivalent with the delusion or the habit, the negative trait. So you're not seeing it as I'm simply having fear in my mind. There's anger or fear in my mind, but rather that I am fearful, I am afraid. Then the third level, she says, is I am a fearful person. Goes on to create a solidification of the experience. This is where you start seeing yourself through that lens. I mean, how many of you have dealt with people? I had people I knew that would say, I'm just an angry person. You know, that's a pretty solid identification at that point. You're not saying, oh, I'm a person who has angry thoughts, or I occasionally have angry thoughts, or there are angry thoughts in my mind. You're really getting to that solid level where that is your identity, that you're an angry person, you're a fearful person, you're a whatever person, fill in the blank. Well, that's not such a helpful place to be, right? Because you've solidified your identity to be equivalent to that. Then does it seem so changeable? Probably not. You know why? Because it becomes one of our character traits, becomes part of our personality. So I think this is useful stuff. Martine says, at different times we may use these phrases as ways of describing much the same experience, but each one registers a discrete perception we have of ourselves and makes us feel differently. The more we repeat them, the more we entrench that perception and feeling. So I'm pointing this out as one of the factors that are part of this mistaken conceptualizations, is that this can be one that contributes, is when we start identifying too strongly with these simply passing thoughts, these habitual things that, yeah, we've created the causes for them to arise, but they are simply arising in our minds. They're not there all the time. When we think, I am an angry person, the implication is that's who we are all the time. But we know from our experience that that's not so. So just, it's one thing that is kind of a gentle reminder that we are beings that simply have these experiences, and we should kind of avoid, if we can, identifying with them so strongly. Another one that plays a role, and I just, again, these are from some of my own observation in my own mind, but also in talking to others, is expectations. And this is another mistaken conceptualization to some degree. Now, some people point out, well, what about realistic expectations versus unrealistic expectations? But even sometimes we might have realistic expectations, but that doesn't mean that things go according to those expectations. We're living in a world where people can often do things that aren't very realistic or in line with what we see as reality. So I think we have to be a little generous in looking at this and thinking that there's something about expectations that are almost a setup. There's a phrase actually that one student mentioned when I taught this the first time. Expectations are premeditated resentments. You know, we're gonna and in the end probably resent the other person because they're not living up to our expectations, or they're going to resent us for having the expectations, or, you know, resentment is frequently a part of expectations because it's a sort of setup for things to not go the way we'd like them to, or the way that we think that they should. So expectations in my mind are kind of this double vision of things. We have this view of kind of what is, and we also have a view at the same time of what we would like it to be. So there's kind of a potential double standard going on here. I want to share, whoops, it's not in here. I brought that book with me, Martine's book. She has a wonderful story of how she had this experience where she realized her expectations were sort of going out of control. And I'll share it with you because I think it's useful. Another thing that we do in terms of visual objects is to visually grasp at something that is not there. This is especially pernicious. In 2000, my husband and I moved from England to live in France, she says. Our house was in the process of renovation. We converted the attic into my husband's office and a small meditation room, but we needed a staircase to reach these rooms. I had the vision of a beautiful staircase in hard wood. However, it was difficult to get a good carpenter. I guess they needed you, Jake. He says, she said, and in desperation, we asked the only carpenter we could find to make it. We did not get the dreamed of staircase. Instead, we had to settle for something very functional in pine with steep steps. She says, whenever I used it, there was a feeling of discrepancy and distaste. Until I paid close attention, I started to notice that when I trod on it, I was actually seeing two staircases next to each other. The one that was there and the other imagined one that wasn't. I did not encounter the staircase as it was, but as it should have been. The frustration was totally self-created and unnecessary. As soon as I saw that I was grasping at something that was not there, I let go, and then could use the humble staircase peacefully. After all, it did the job well enough. You know, so it's a nice example that just kind of points out to how much are we doing that with the people in our lives in particular, seeing them always through a lens of who we expect them to be or would like them to be, an overlay of how we'd like them to be, and not seeing them for who they are, and not sort of having that acceptance. They're, after all, perfectly functional just as they are. We might have a desire to help them to some degree, but we have to find a skillful way to do that. And it's not going to be skillful if we're constantly seeing them as something that they aren't, and something we think they should be, our expectations. So I just point this out, that I think our expectations are also a key role in the thought processes that feed the arisal of the delusions. Because when we've set it up already, you know, we've created this illusion that others are to live up to, or that the situation is supposed to be, and it doesn't do that. We're going to have a tendency for delusions to arise, a tendency for us to get upset, annoyed, frustrated, whatever the case might be, or even go on to being more judgmental or more, you know, all these other types of patterns can arise from it. So again, check these up to see what degree these are playing a role in regard to your own conceptualizations.
I have
Yes, Christine.
a remark about expectation. So yes, you know, I do not expect regular people like at work or on the street or at the store to be gentle, kind, loving, and all that. But people who know the Dharma,
Right.
and who are supposedly practicing the Dharma,
I like how you said supposedly.
I do have an expectation because, you know, it's like we study the same thing. We know we're supposed to do, you know, the four immeasurable and all that, and yet,
They aren't doing it.
yeah. So I have a problem with that.
You know, I knew somebody who worked in the FPMT office, and maybe I shouldn't talk about the office, but there were quite a few practitioners who'd been around the Dharma an awful long time. And we'd still have a lot of folks in the FPMT who've been around for decades. And we might look at them and go, God, they've been practicing the Dharma for 40 years and they're still fill in the blank. You know, they're still get upset so easily, or they don't really, you know, live their life that compassionately, or whatever judgment we put on them. And I reminded this person that, you know, we've been dealing with the delusion since beginningless time. You know, and even if you've got 4 decades, 5 decades, 6 decades of practicing it in this lifetime, that's really nothing. It's kind of, I mean, I'm not trying to discourage people by saying that, because I think there's that other side of us that go, well, what, it's hopeless then. If we look at these people and they've been practicing for decades and they haven't changed really. Well, first of all, do we really know they haven't changed? You know, we didn't know them 40, 50 years ago, and we can't say, maybe they used to get angry like that, and now they get angry, you know, occasionally. So we can't really have those expectations. I think that's another part of this in regard to others, but we can't even have it in regard to ourselves. This is part of our kind of self-compassion, is to recognize that we're involved in a very, very difficult process. These are called the 3 difficulties for a reason, and the whole path is not an easy path in some regard. Nonetheless, it's a path that works. It is a path that will work over time. But we shouldn't get so invested in thinking everyone around us who's practicing the Dharma has to manifest those changes for us right now, because I think it's going to take everyone their own time. You know, we're all at kind of different starting points to some degree too. I mean, some people might have some good work they've done in prior lives, so they come into this life and they pick it up again and they're humming along and doing just really well. And we can't compare ourselves to them, nor should we compare other people to them, because everyone's at a different point. Nonetheless, again, if we do see things that we can help others with skillfully, not in ways that are driven by our own, frustration at them or whatever. We have ways that we can, encourage them to see things that perhaps they haven't seen for themselves. It's nice to offer that. I mean, I always encourage people to ask before we do anything to intervene in other people's stuff. Would we want necessarily would I want all of you in the room to start giving me advice on how I should practice? Probably not, We just have that strong sense of, well, we're adults, so we can take care of ourselves and know what we're doing. But if you had something to offer to me, if you had some constructive advice, it'd be nice to say, well, there's something I noticed and I'd be happy to share that with you, but I'll leave it up to you. So when we're looking at others, this is what I was saying earlier, that we should be hearing these teachings really ideally through the lens of applying them to ourselves. Because that's really the whole gist of what the Buddha taught, is for each of us to be our own therapist, to be our own person guiding our own lives. If we see other people that we think these teachings would be useful for, and that we would like to point out things in them that maybe we think they're blind to, well, then we have to find a skillful way to do that, because most people don't want to hear that, just like we don't want to hear that. So, everyone else's business isn't our business. I love Venerable Rabina when I started talking about something, he said, that's none of your friggin' business. She didn't use friggin'. It's just like, it makes it really clear, and we should acknowledge that. And so my caveat in all of this is that if we do feel some compassionate motivation to help others and helping them in that way, ask for permission to do that, really. Don't just start throwing advice around like it's a panacea for everybody's suffering. I don't know. Does that help a little bit? Yeah. Maybe you still want to expect them to be better.
No, it's just, I don't go tell them, well, you're supposed to do this, but I'm like, wait a minute. We already learned about, whatever, and
right.
Then, but how come you're not, in my mind, how come you're not practicing it? It's like,
Yeah.
I'm a little bit disillusioned.
Well, sure, but yeah. But I think once more, we can't make the assumption that everybody's going to hear the teachings the same way, that everyone's going to be able to apply them the same way, that we're all going to be able to practice to the degree that we're finding through our own practice. But once more, if we see that, try to use that as a mirror for ourselves and check up and see, to what extent am I not following all the teachings to the degree that ideally I should? Because if we were, we'd be enlightened. I mean, seriously. So I'm not enlightened. I don't know about all of you. You could all be Buddhas for all I know. But since I'm not enlightened, well, then anything I see that's faults in others, I can see them in myself. I can see my own deficiencies, my own ways that I'm not practicing to that degree. So, yeah, Joe, were you going to share something?
I'm just going to add a funny story that kind of
Sure.
helps with that. So at Tushita, I was taking a class with Geshe Wangmo, which is the first female Geshe. And we were talking about this concept. A lot of people had the same kind of feedback. And she told this story of the fact that in theory, like if you look at the statistics of things, like if practitioners are bodhisattvas to become Buddhas to help all sentient beings, and our karma allows us to see people only to a certain extent. Her point was the fact that theoretically at some point everyone around you could be a Buddha except for you, and you'll never know it, in which case that person that you see as angry and not practicing the Dharma is actually trying to teach you a lesson of patience, of pride, of something. And so I thought it was a really interesting story, because it really, like, for me, it changed how my mind thought concrete and judgmental to being more open. Right. And then on top of it, all of a sudden, like you said, it reflected back, whereas like instead of me looking into them and what's up with them, but looking back at myself and being like, oh, again, it comes back to my internal process and practice.
No, that's really helpful. Yeah, I sometimes joke about that too. I say, well, I don't know, all you could be Buddhas, and you're here just to help me go blah, blah, blah about the Dharma so I can eventually become enlightened, and I'm sorry it's taking me so long, Hang in there. Keep doing what you're doing. But there is a helpful tool to kind of look at others as our teachers, Doesn't mean that they're necessarily Buddhas, but we can still learn from them. We can learn from what they're going through and what they share about their lives and so on. So, Any other comments on that, on expectations? Because I think that is an important one. I'm going to say two more things that I think are part of these thought processes. I've kind of highlighted the main ones, but this is another one that the best words for it are kind of storylines. Storylines that we tell ourselves about others. And a bit of what Christine's saying might be a storyline that if you look at others and you say, okay, they were at the teaching on the four immeasurables, they're supposed to be practicing compassion to all beings. Well, why are they like this? You're telling yourself a story to some extent about that person, about their deficiencies or inabilities to practice the Dharma to the extent that you think that they should. We do that a lot. We have a lot of conceptual overlays that are not just what I was saying earlier about seeing the person as the sum total of those negative things that they're manifesting. They're a whole other dimension to it because we tell ourselves a story about who they are and make up something about them that may be totally out of touch with reality as well. I like the story that Jack Kornfield shared. Was a gentleman who was in the military actually going through an MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction course. And he was in his 6th of 8 weeks of this mindfulness-based course. And he happened to be at the grocery store one day at the craziest time of day when everybody's off work and the lines are really long. And he gets into line with all of his cart full of groceries, the regular line, not the express line. And he looks up a few people and he sees this woman holding a baby. And she's got one item. He's like, well, why is this woman in my line? She should be in the express lane. She's only got one item. Starts telling this whole story about, this woman obviously being really inconsiderate and awful that she's another person in this line that's going to hold up everything. And then he realizes, I need to practice my MBSR. I need to reduce my stress by being more mindful and knowing what's going on and da-da-da. It kind of calms down. And then eventually that woman with the baby is up at the cashier and she's checking out. And all of a sudden, she's handing the baby to the cashier, the woman who's there, and the woman who's the cashier is holding the baby up and going goo goo gaga with it and all this stuff. And so the man starts, churning again. He's got all this stuff going on, all the storyline he's saying about why is she doing this and what's going on, and doesn't she know that all these people are behind us, behind her, and why is she showing the baby to this woman and goo goo gaing all over the baby and. And he realizes, I better be practicing my MBSR. So he goes back to calming his mind and gets into a better place. Finally, that woman leaves and he gets up there to the front eventually and he tells the cashier, because he's quite calmed down by now, he says, oh, that was a pretty baby that woman had, wasn't it? And the woman says, oh, you think so? That was my son, and that's my mother, and ever since my husband died, I've had to work 2 jobs. And so the only time I get a chance to see my son is when my mother brings him in, And so it's total different story, right? Yeah. We don't know what people's stories are, and we make up a storyline about how they are and how they're inconsiderate and how they aren't thinking of others, when in reality, she was in that line for a reason, She wanted, her grandson to spend a little more time with his mother. So once more, we don't know. You're in the car, you see that red face behind you. You don't know everything that's going on with that person, And they may be just dealing with their own crazy deluded mind. But nonetheless, why do we make up that story about them and hold them to be that again? Because we have this tendency to just have this conceptual overlay. And another contributing factor to that is this kind of mind of rumination, this mind that can be positive in some regard if we ruminate on things that can be solved, but frequently we're ruminating about stuff that isn't going to be solved. It's just going to kind of keep escalating. It's like I said, that downward spiral that just keeps getting tighter and tighter and tighter. We just keep going back to the same thing and repeating it about that person or that situation, that event. I mean, look at even when you've had that happen, I'm sure you've had the experience of sitting on your meditation cushion to do your meditation when earlier in the day you've had one of those types of events, and you just keep running it through your mind of what they said and how they were and what you should have said and what you didn't say. And we do have a tendency to get carried away in these crazy minds of ours. Just to be aware that when we say mistaken conceptualizations, that was the third of these 6 factors that feed into these negative states, that is a pretty big topic. Our minds have unbelievable ways of complicating things. So we just have to begin to have some awareness that that's going on and some levity around it. This is the one thing I always like to emphasize is, when you see your mind doing it, try to laugh at yourself. I mean, just say, oh God, there's my crazy mind going off again. It's easier to let it go when we have some levity around it. If we're taking it too seriously, then we end up beating ourselves up and thinking, like Christine's thinking about other people, we think that about ourselves. Oh God, I'm not living up to what I'm supposed to be. I'm a horrible bodhisattva, whatever, if you're even a bodhisattva. That's already a pretty tall order. But so just know that this whole dimension of the mistaken conceptualizations is a huge one to pay attention to. All the thoughts that we're adding to this after we've met with the object and we had the seeds for the delusion or the habit to arise, we then can see that it gets fed by all of this mistaken thinking. Now, again, when all that thinking, it feeds into the delusion, as I said, it's quite easy to catch it, or at least to stop it, when it is quite small. As we start feeding it, as we put more and more fuel on the fire, it becomes something that's pretty unwieldy. It's going to be harder to overcome at that point, but nonetheless, stop it when you can. I'll share this story that is of a student that he's given me permission to use this. I worked with him individually, met with him because he was trying to work on his anger issues, and he shared this with me, and I was very happy he shared it with me, and I'm sharing it with you. I've shared it before, so you probably have heard it before, but some of you at least. He was driving and had one of these incidents where he had a very irritated driver behind him. He got to one of these roundabouts that are in Santa Fe out by the college, and he stopped, and there was a car coming around, and there was probably room for him to get in front of that car, but he decided to just be very patient and wait so that car could come completely around, and the person behind him didn't like this at all and started honking and getting very angry, and he sees him in his rearview mirror, and he goes like this to flip him up, but he stops. And he doesn't extend his finger. And he tells me this, and I was like, congratulations. That was fantastic. Because I think we think that suddenly, again, that we're supposed to be all at peace now. We flip the switch, and we're just going to have no bad thoughts, nothing going on. We're just going to be totally at ease with the world. Well, no. I mean, that's not how it works. Sometimes it's even we get the finger up and we flip the other person off, but then we go, oh my gosh, I just gave into it again. I just followed that habit, that pattern. So we have to understand this is a process of change. And to change some of these thoughts is pretty difficult work. But what else do we have to do at some level? Sure, you got the laundry list and all the other stuff, but this is really the work that we need to do, and we just keep investing in it. And eventually we get to where, the hand doesn't go up. Maybe it stays down here. We still are kind of glaring in the mirror. But then eventually we stop glaring in the mirror, and eventually we are totally at peace. But it takes time to get there. Maybe we're sending them out loving kindness through the rearview mirror, whatever. But that's going to be a while before we get there. So we just take our time. Anyway, that's probably enough on that factor. Any other final comments? All right. So as I said, we looked at contact with the object, these predispositions or seeds, the inappropriate attention. The fourth thing is actually kind of interesting because it's what we're kind of talking about in this weekend, which is habit. This is one of the factors that actually does play a role in these negative states arising, is our habitual buying into them. And that's why we're looking at all this, is to try to break some of that habit. But why we have anger arising more frequently in our minds, or jealousy, or whatever the case might be, fear, like we were talking about earlier today, why we have that kind of emotion registering is because we become habituated to it. This can be one factor. Again, this isn't always playing a role, but this is one factor that can stimulate these negative states arising. So this is why we want to engage in this type of investigation this weekend, is because habit is a factor that feeds these tendencies. You just keep getting better and better at doing it. So as we were talking about earlier in regard to identification, somebody who sees themselves as an angry person is simply somebody who's very habituated to anger. They've made anger something that is their go-to response. It's their default mode. Just keeps coming up again and again and again because they become habituated to it. What's nice to know about habit is that habit is equally effective on the positive side. This is what the verse I shared last night from Master Shantideva that says there's nothing whatsoever that doesn't become easier through the force of familiarity, through habituation. So the more that we do the positive things, the more that we practice loving kindness and compassion and so on to others, the more that's going to be our default mode. When we see others who are even angry and upset at us, we'll naturally have a thought of compassion rather than thoughts of anger, what have you. So just know that habit itself is said to be one of the main factors that cause particular negative states to arise. We've kind of conditioned ourselves to have that as our response. The last two that I'm going to talk about, and then we'll go on to the second task of counteracting these negative states, are both kind of outside influences. So far we've been mostly talking about kind of what's within our own minds or what sort of things are going on, particularly with these last three. The first one, of course, is an object. Sometimes we can have our own thoughts be the object, just so you know that it's not always something outside of us. Words we hear, like the criticism or whatever we were talking about. Sometimes it is something even within our own minds, our memory or whatever that we bring into our field of experience, and suddenly it's all kind of being created within our minds. But these two are kind of factors that do have some bearing. The first one is the influence of misleading companions. Different words for these. Sometimes they talk about them as bad friends. We are influenced by the people we hang out with. One interesting thing I've found in practicing the Dharma for these years is that there's almost a natural delimiting of who's in our circle by virtue of what we're about and what we're doing. It's not like I had to tell people, get out of my life because I don't want you around. I never said that to anybody. Rather, as I became clearer and clearer about where I was going and what I wanted to do and the people I wanted to be with, it became clearer and clearer that some people simply fell by the wayside. They simply weren't on the bus. That's not what was happening. For them, at least. And it doesn't mean I lose compassion for them, but I do see that there are certain people who would potentially take me astray. Now, there's pretty strong views that you might find on some of this sort of stuff. I think it was in a teaching that Lama Zopa gave. There was a text by this Rinpoche, Achos Rinpoche. I don't know much about him. But he was making the comment that you should discard misleading friends like you would essentially use toilet paper. I think he used the word, discard them like a rock you used for wiping your bottom. It's like, that's interesting. I'm glad that we've advanced a little bit in the West. Charmin is a little bit softer than a rock. So that's pretty strong to say, like, you would discard those people like you would use toilet paper or, a soiled rock. So I don't think that means, again, that we're having this sort of negative reaction to them. It just means that we begin to see that there's a difference in the trajectory we're headed towards and where they're headed towards. And we see that if we continue to follow their trajectory, we're going to be more inclined to be off of our own. We're going to not continue to do the practice that we need to do. So it might mean occasionally saying, well, no, I don't really want to go to your party and hang out with everybody who's drinking and talking about politics or whatever, that we'd rather stay at home and do our meditation or Dharma reading or whatever it is that we do, or even just be quiet and peaceful at home. It doesn't have to look grand or anything. I think that that's okay to do those sorts of things, but not to do it in really mean or malicious ways, to kind of make people feel that there's something wrong with them, that we're not hanging out with them because that's kind of almost cultish behavior, Don't hang around with me because the teachings say that I shouldn't have anything to do with you. That's really not what we're talking about. We're just simply watching your own mind. And it's almost like I was saying earlier, like if you know that you have a problem with a particular thing, I think this is what Christine was saying, then stay distant from it to some degree. When we've got strength of mind, you can be with people who are not on the same wavelength as you and have a very calm mind in the midst of it and not get sucked into a lot of the patterns. Kind of like what they tell people who are newly dealing with substance abuse or alcohol abuse issues, right? If somebody's wanting to break away from that pattern of behavior, you don't go hang out with all your bar buddies, right? You don't hang out around alcohol and with people who are drinking because it's going to be too much of a draw for you to drink as well. There are cases of people who've been away from it long enough and developed the strength of mind through their own practice of the 12 steps and so on to be able to be in the presence of alcohol and not have it be a draw for them. And they still can know that there's a challenge there, but it's not the same thing. It's very much like that here. It's not to say that these people will never be anybody that you associate with, because actually in the mind training teachings it said that we should actually hold these beings who are quite difficult and challenging to be unbelievable teachers for us. But we don't have the strength of mind right now to do that. So if we hang out with them, we're going to probably get sucked into their patterns. So just know that that's one factor that causes us to have some of these habitual patterns and negative states, is that other people do have a bearing on us. As much as we like to think we're our own person when we're out with others, we do frequently go with the crowd. You know, if everybody jumped off a cliff, would you do it too? Remember our parents telling us that? Yeah. We come and say, oh, well, Johnny was doing it and Billy was doing it. Well, anyway. Any questions or comments on that one? I think it's pretty straightforward. The next one is also some things that come in from outside. And this is following, I'm sorry, yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, Jake.
So when you're, I think that the point you just touched on was really, really good and very, very important for me, because it's kind of been something I've been struggling with.
Uh-huh.
When I'm in, I'm a fairly direct person, but I don't always relate to the other views that are commonly found in my field.
Right.
I've been recently, trying to make a different decision, finding a different path.
Mm-hmm.
And on one hand, I felt like, okay, well, with meditation, I should be able to separate myself from this. I should be able to keep myself from following a way of thinking or a way of being. And it was very difficult to kind of separate myself from starting to think in a different way, or starting to see things in the way that they were seeing it, because I was right there in the middle of what they've been in the middle of for the last 14 years. And you'll look at some of these guys, and I go, whoa, you've been here way too long, man. I'm not sure I want to be that guy, I think that, so I think it's, thank you, basically. Reassuring that, I think I'm on the right track.
Good. I know it can be difficult, Jake, because we are, shifting in a way that can be different than the people around us that we've grown to have some strong association with and all that. So once more, to try not to throw them out of our heart, and we still hold them in the space of having good thoughts towards them, compassion for them, loving kindness for them, and so on. And see, and once more, if we do see them from the vantage point of, now we know our own minds to some degree, we've got some grasp on what's happening and how we've been following these habits and patterns, well, then we can see them through that lens, that they're under the control of these factors. We frequently use that phrase in Buddhism, that sentient beings are under the control of their karma and delusions. We see to what extent that's true. This is a bit more what Christine was saying too, when we see people who've learned the teachings that they are under the control of those and they know that there's a better way to be, we almost think that that's well, then they can do it. What's the problem? But these are people who don't even have that knowledge generally. So the world at large doesn't have any understanding that they're under the control of these factors. And so they're really being guided by them in ways that we're becoming aware of and starting to learn about our own minds. They don't even have that knowledge. So even a greater source of compassion for us. But we can see how easily their influence can take us in directions that we don't want to go, so we maintain healthy distance if we can, or when we're with them, at least we try to put the brakes on it, go home early, or do something to not get too carried away with it until we have the strength of mind to be with them in a different way. Yeah, but it's great. And thank you for acknowledging that, though. It's really an important part of our path for most of us. Yeah, Joe?
For that point, is it normal to feel kind of detached and lonely in that situation? So if you stepped aside from your friends and then came back to it and you view them as being underneath, karmic suffering and things like that, it's almost is it normal to almost feel like you're not detaching them, like the relationship feels different, in which case you sympathize and you have compassion for them, but you don't view them, I guess you're not, I don't know, it's maybe because you're not quite like ignorant to it anymore and you're not in it, so you're not as bonded with them as you used to be. I don't know how to explain it, but
I think I'm getting a bit of what you're talking about. It will feel different invariably, simply because we're not under the control of those factors in the same way that we were before. It's like we're not falling prey to that, so it'll seem a bit foreign and a bit distant from where our minds are at. But I think that's where, again, over time, we should try to soften our hearts to be able to be in the space of that, and that will also feel different, to be with them in the space of real genuine compassion and concern for them, nonetheless recognizing that we may not be able to do much to help them in their situation at the moment, because our minds are, again, our own business to some degree, and doesn't mean we don't try or don't find what skillful ways we can to help others. But that may be why particular relationships end, is simply because we're no longer where they were. We were there before, hanging out with them and enjoying that type of lifestyle and times and whatever, and now we're in a very different place. So I think the loneliness can be supplanted by these feelings of genuine empathy and concern for them as beings, as well as we start enlarging our heart in that way. But we also find that we're not completely isolating ourselves. We have our Dharma communities that really do support us. That's why when we think about, the refuge in the Three Jewels, frequently we talk about the teachings. That's the big thing, right? And that's why our primary refuge is the Dharma. And then we talk about the Buddha a lot because we like to, admire the Buddha and really feel connection to this, being who represents what we're trying to attain. Frequently what gets left out of the equation is the Sangha. And the Sangha, in a technical way, means those beings who have gained these really deeper realizations. But Sangha, in a more general way, is really the community that we need to support ourselves on our path. It doesn't mean that we don't have times when we're off in isolation doing solitary retreat or what have you. That's something that is important, but it means that we do rely upon others who are like-minded and doing the same work, because we do need them on our path. It's another lesson I've learned myself, but I also see in other people that sometimes think that a community isn't necessary. I think a community is a key part of it for most of us, for at least the formative years of our Buddhist practice, when we're really trying to get it secure and grounded, is to really rely upon the support that like-minded people in the room can supply to you. So it's almost like it gets replaced. What you had with those other people shouldn't leave you feeling lonely and isolated, but feel you even a stronger sense of wanting to connect with like-minded people who can support you in what you're trying to do. That can be hard, and sometimes it means even family members might be left behind to some degree. But hopefully we can once more find a way to still be with people and deepen our connection to them at different levels than what it was before, because we're more open-hearted towards them. We're seeing them through a different lens. But I don't know if does that help any?
Yeah.
Is there any other experiences people have in the room? I mean, I'm not the only person who's needs to talk here. Yeah, Anne.
Oh, no, I was just kind of reflecting on this whole thing is, like, over the time I've been practicing, yeah, the type of people I'm willing to be with has really changed a lot.
Uh-huh.
And it's kind of less, fewer people, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
And so it does get a little bit lonely sometimes. But, I mean, and the other thing is that the practice takes time. If you have a meditation, daily meditation practice, that takes time, and going to programs and all that. So, your energy starts going in kind of different places.
Sure.
I have one very old friend that I have kept, sort of maintained as a friend. Partly just because she's a really old friend and knows my family and everything, but I find her a little difficult. But the thing I like about still being a friend with her is she really reminds me of what samsara is. Illustrates it.
It's a good lesson. Yeah.
Sort of keeps me a little bit in touch with the rest of the world. So I don't know. But yeah, it's not easy, I don't think.
Yeah. That phrase is almost like what they say Lama Atisha when he went to Tibet from India. He didn't know what the Tibetan people were going to be like, and he really wanted to make sure he could continue his practice of patience. So he brought along this really difficult Bengali tea boy who would like push his buttons. And so then, of course, the story goes that when he got to Tibet, he realized that he didn't need to bring the Bengali tea boy, that the Tibetans were totally capable of pushing his buttons. So. But no, it's like whatever, if we're going to be with people and continue to have the relationship, sure, make it into our own Dharma lesson in a sense, having the understanding that this is the patterns that we see that do play out for most beings in the world, that they're under the control of these factors. Deepen our compassion and our connection to them at that level, as seeing them suffering from that. And as I said, if we can help them, by all means help them. But each of us has to find, what we're comfortable doing. It's very hard to help others. Yeah, Millie, were you going to share something?
Yeah, I was going to just talk a little bit about what you were saying and about what he was saying about the loneliness and things
Sure.
of that stuff, and how family, it can distance family as well because behavior is different and
Right.
actions. And so currently I'm going through a little bit of some distance and whatever with my son and daughter. And it's taking a lot of patience on my part and a lot of not wanting to say certain things,
Right.
and yet remembering that I still need to continue on with my path because I know I'm being looked at with a microscope, and I mean really a microscope, and the words that they use and that they say have been really hurtful, and I realize that on one hand I'm very happy that they are able to say those things,
Sure.
and yet they come back and they say, now you understand, Mom, we love you very much, that's why we're saying these things, and et cetera, et cetera. So then therefore I realize that, they have expectations of their mother and that they are wanting me to behave in a certain way. And so just like when they were growing up as teenagers,
Right.
I had certain expectations as well,
Yeah.
and that with their father and with all the family members. And now with trying to practice the Buddhism, I'm understanding that, I was, I understand that they learned those expectation stuff from me.
Yeah.
And so now I'm beginning to understand okay, now they're my Buddha,
Right.
where I need to really see this because this is an area where I haven't grown. And it's don't give up,
Yeah. Good.
and it's very difficult. And yet I know that this is what I have to do. And it does feel very, very alone.
Right. Yeah.
And family,
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't talk to my brother for 17 years. And my mother knew that I didn't want to be in the same home with him. And so then we were able to talk. And now it's back to, well, that's why, because you still are kind of the same way. And so I'm looking at my brother as definitely a Buddha alongside with my son and daughter.
Wonderful.
Well, no, it's taking a lot of, it takes a lot of energy and knowing that it's not me, it's not totally me, because in a relationship, it's not just one person.
Sure.
It's
Sure.
everybody else. So there's, the antidote to anger is patience,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
So I have to be patient with myself because I'm so quick to say, what did I say, or did my eyes roll back when they said something?
All our
this
body
stuff.
language, yeah.
All the body language.
Yeah.
And you really are with them, and so that's the whole.
But it sounds like all of it is going to increase the depth of your practice and your ability to be with others in more genuine ways. It's hard going through the process, don't you think?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that's why I'm here today.
Yeah. Well, good. No, I think that our relationships are complex, particularly family. But if we really think about it once more from karma, they often say you can choose your family, but you can't choose you can choose your friends, but you can't choose your family. And I'm like, well, no, you choose both, really. Because karmically you've chosen them. But we didn't choose them quite so consciously. We were choosing them through the force of like creating exactly what we needed to learn from. Again, that's the best way to look at life is, all of this is karma manifesting, and we got something we can learn from it. So open up our eyes, roll up our sleeves, and just go into it. And it's hard. Yeah.
Have you had any reflections about expectations as they pertain to the duration of what a family should be? Meaning forever, or at least in this life. Do you know what I mean? It's sort of like, what if they do fall by the wayside and you wish them love?
Yeah.
And that you're done. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just a new thought to me. I just was
Well,
listening
I think
to
that's part of boundaries, right?
Well,
like
but
how much can they handle and how
That's-
much can I handle?
that's right.
And so you have to separate. And so separation is okay. It doesn't mean that they don't love me. They
And-
just don't like the behavior that I'm demonstrating to them right now.
Mhm.
And so, and the same goes for me. So I need separation to just,
Yeah.
and they
But I
need
mean,
to.
I'm right now worried about a family that I've known for years.
Mhm.
And one of their sons hasn't spoken to their parents for 6 years. They
Mhm.
were the ideal family,
Oh, sure.
and they've had this, and then I think, well, maybe the karma's just over. Instead of how bad, and how dare they not have the skills to figure this out, and what's wrong with that boy? It's just like, can we even say that it can be over? I don't know.
No.
In terms of family, that's what I was trying to ask. It's sort of like, how much should you hang in there just because we've got family on it? DNA's involved. I don't know.
You just kind of go, like I said, I didn't speak to my brother for 17 years.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't be under the same roof
Mm-hmm.
with him. And my parents knew that while they
Yeah.
were living.
Right.
And so then we started discussing again, and then he's just a very angry person.
Yeah. Rubina once said to me when I told her about a woman I'd had a fight with, that she was my best friend, and
Yeah.
I thought we were so close we could have had our own YouTube channel before
Right.
I knew about YouTube. And I just thought our telephone conversations were the most funny, fabulous, wise things.
Right.
And then we had a falling out, and I said, Rubina, I think I've had this breakthrough, and I really have forgiven her for her part in our mess. And I said, but you know what? I really don't feel like reaching out to her anymore. Meaning, getting close to her again. She said, Lynn, you don't have to hate a snake. You just don't have to invite it on your lap. So
Right.
with your brother, maybe it's just no lap time, honey.
Yeah, totally. I get that. And
Maybe we were
I've
close.
had fallings out with my best friends that I've known since whatever.
Yeah.
And when my husband was killed unexpectedly 4 years ago almost, these two gals couldn't understand, and it was drawing us, and so they had talked with me, and I felt very alone, and I said to them, I remember saying to them, you guys have no idea because you still have your husbands of 30 plus. I mean, we were married for close to, 33 years. And for him to be killed unexpectedly is something I don't wish for anybody because we had made amends, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just now, and it's, like I said, it's getting to be 4 years, and when we have this discussion with these friends, they have since gone through the death of their parents, and the one gal is going through some other stuff with her parents, which when I was going through the stuff with my parents, I wasn't allowed to talk about it, or they poo-poo me. And so it's there again, when a person is really going through that experience that's when it becomes really crystal clear
Right.
of you don't know what somebody's going through until you're going
Sure.
through it.
Yeah.
You really, really don't. And you
Mhm.
never know when that tsunami is going to hit you.
Yeah.
When there's a smell or a certain date
Right.
or whatever. But it's a profound grieving of, realizing that the relationships with my friends, with my children, with my everybody is changing. And so finding a new normalcy.
Yeah.
What is normal?
Sure. Yeah.
We each have to find our new normalcy from our losses.
Thank you for sharing all that, Millie. And again, I would hope that as the healing continues for you, and especially to rely again upon the companions and the people who can support you in what you're doing and in your practice and trying to move in that direction consistently. It's hard work and may not get all the support that you'd like to from the people who have been in your life, but new people are there to help you in that process. So I would hope that, again, the Sangha, the community, can be of great support to you in doing that.
The center has been really, really helpful, as well as
good.
the other centers of
Mhm.
Land of Medicine Buddha and
Wonderful.
Vajrapani, and just going on the websites with Pema Children and the readings, the Dharma, the three jewels of the the Dharma, the
Wonderful.
Sangha, and the Buddha.
Yeah.
Remembering those
Yeah. Good.
and just breathing.
Yeah. Well, you're doing it very well, I can tell. So keep doing it. Yeah. Good. Thanks for sharing that. Was there, did you have your hand up? Are you okay? Okay. So again, this is this fifth one that we were looking at, of the influence of our companions, our friends, who might be misleading for us, who might be treacherous for us, difficult for us. But we see that, again, if we do follow them without any real measure of controlling our minds, we can frequently be misled in particular directions that won't be so useful for our practice, that will cause these negative states to arise more habitually, more frequently. The sixth one is kind of another interesting one. In some teachings, in the traditional teachings, it's set out as following false teachings, meaning following sort of false systems of looking at things, ways that we've kind of been indoctrinated into by the world around us. In modern interpretations of this, and actually I think it was a meditation by Venerable Thupten Chodron, she calls this detrimental verbal stimuli as well as stimuli from the media, Because, in the Buddha's day, there wasn't the internet, there weren't, all these other influences. So how do ways of looking at the world get to us, not just through our companions, but through all these various things that we absorb things from? When I taught about this, I think when I first started teaching about this, I used the silly example from the 60s of this way that people were adopting things in the lifestyle in the late 60s of, if it feels good, do it. Did anyone ever hear that? If it feels good, do it. Well, if you lived your life by that kind of teaching, I mean, because it is a sort of, it's not, formal teaching. Somebody didn't like the school of California good vibes or something that says this. This is, something that we got through our society at the time, that, it's all about embracing just the magic of the moment, and if it feels good, do it, and da-da-da. Well, if you lived your life like that, you probably wouldn't engage in the most wholesome of activities. Maybe you would. I don't know. Maybe. Yeah, I mean, you can follow a lot of distorted views to some pretty extreme behaviors. And I think that we get this not just from organized systems, such as, other religious systems or philosophical systems or whatever, but we also get it from these various stimuli, from things that feed into it. I mean, we don't want to open the can of worms that was the election of 2016, but to some degree what they've pointed out in terms of the bubble that each of us to some degree was living in terms of the things that we surrounded ourselves that complemented our own views, are a bit of this. And regardless, I'm not getting into whether those are right views or wrong views. I mean, that's a whole nother discussion, and that maybe isn't part of what. Nonetheless, each of us, to some degree, has surrounded ourselves with the type of media and the type of influences, and read the particular articles and things that are complementary to how we think, that keep feeding some view of the world of how we think the world should be. That sometimes can make us blind to other people's perspectives on how the world should be. Whether, again, it's right or wrong, well, that's a whole other discussion. But I'm just saying that acknowledge that these are factors that do feed into potentially our arisal of delusions. Because if we start living our lives with those influences coming in, frequently we won't necessarily follow the Dharma at a purer level. We won't really be able to avoid some of these distorted states of mind. Yeah, Millie?
So the other thing that I wanted to say was also how when family and friends and people that I just, the teller, cashier checking me out, they're all people that I may not know. I mean, we're all at different levels, but we're all integrated.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we all are going to affect each other's life at some point or another. So that, like this cup and the water, I mean, the person that was probably doing all that stuff, he may be a person that might be calling me, or going really slow or whatever, and yet he's done something really good for me that I may not be aware of.
Right.
And so when I think about that, and when somebody gives me the opportunity to get into the line of traffic from getting out of a parking lot, I remember, we need to show that kindness to each other as well. And so it does make me feel good to know that, okay, we're all in this boat of life, samsara, together.
Good. No, and that's a really positive one to kind of apply in our lives, to really have that perspective.
There's too much negativity in this world right now, and that I believe we just need to really think about the positive things, and that's what I really am enjoying about the teachings of the Dharma.
Yeah, good. Thanks for sharing. Yeah. Any other comments on this one? Again, this is a pretty broad category. What Venerable Thupten Chodron says in her meditation. I was thinking about doing a meditation. We'll take a break shortly, but it's really so warm. I'm not sure it's going to be easy for us to do a meditation. But she says this includes books, television, magazines, newspapers, radio, internet, etc. And, she says how much of the past week was spent being exposed to the media, listening to the radio in the car, channel surfing on the TV, exploring the internet. And if we have good control over our minds, we can frequently do all that and not be fazed by it, or even increase our positive qualities by it. When we see people who would normally anger us and upset us by their views and whatever, we might be able to hold that view, as we were talking about over lunch, of seeing them as somebody who simply wants to be happy, is misguided in how they're going about doing it, but we're going to still see them through that lens, because we're going to choose a mind of loving kindness and compassion, and not a mind of hatred and disgust. So again, it's not to say that in any of these that these are absolutes, but rather that these are factors that can influence us, especially if we don't have the strength of mind to be able to know how to use them in more skillful ways. Because again, just go to any of these websites where they have the opportunity for people to post their stuff at the bottom. I mean, just read a few of those, and my gosh, but just to get a feeling for how those stimuli can be so upsetting for people. They can really just pull people in. As soon as they see something that they disagree with, they have to go into all sorts of vitriolic comments that are just really unbelievable. And then the people who respond to that because they don't like that vitriolic comment, and then the people who, it just is kind of crazy.
Non-ending.
So if we be aware of these and know that, again, we don't have to absolutely shut these things out of our lives, but really be honest with ourselves and looking at to what degree are we influenced by those. And if our thinking gets influenced by those in ways that causes us to have these habits of being really critical of others, or of thinking that people from particular points of view are wrong absolutely, and we think the worst of them and what have you, watch our minds. And if our minds can't deal with it, then maybe it's best not to have those stimuli. But if we can be with those stimuli, like I said, and actually do something positive, that would be really, really the best use of that. Let's take a little break because everybody's a bit wilted. I feel like I made the mistake. I took some flowers up to friends that they invited me to stay with them up in Mill Valley, and I wanted to just bring some flowers with them. And I left them in the car while I was in a Chinese restaurant for 2 hours. And they just never resuscitated. That's kind of how... I'm not saying you look like that. Maybe that's my perception, but that's a bit of how I'm feeling. Anyway. All right, so enjoy your, let's say, at least 15 minutes, maybe 20, something like that. So somewhere around 3:38. No, 3:35. 3:35. 3:38. Yeah, it's 3:38. It's 18 after 3:38. And 40 seconds.